this will be your second audio recording for the Jacob Lawrence series, and it will be the second part of the introduction. In the third audio recording, I'll start with the works themselves. But if you go on your PowerPoint presentation to slide number 2, this is, once again, that first of the 60 panels in the series. And at the end of the last audio recording, I had given you some numbers, those numbers of the percentage of African Americans in the 3 cities that are mentioned here. And just as another figure to consider when we're thinking about this massive migration of people is in the decade of the 1910s, 437,000 Black Southerners moved from rural communities of the South to urban centers of the North. In the 1920s, that number grows to 810,000. In the 1930s, because of the Great Depression and the economic distress that is felt all over the United States and the world, that number drops to 391,000 people moving from the southern part of the United States to the northern urban centers. But by the 1940s, that number goes up to 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people came in the decade of the 1940s, which is the decade, of course, that begins with this series of art. If you jump down in your PowerPoint presentation to slide number 30, slide number 30 is actually number 60 of the series, the last of the series, and Lawrence's title, "And the Migrants Kept Coming." Remember, he would be painting this in 1941, anticipating this idea that in that decade, 1.5 million people are going to be coming from the rural areas of the southern part of the United States to the northern urban centers. He almost anticipates, he is almost a prophet in many ways of what is to come. And for the 6 decades of the 20th century, all in all, more than 6 million African Americans left farms and the small towns for these centers of the North. And it really is one of the greatest demographic transitions in the course of this country and in the course of the world. 6 million people are leaving their homes to come and find a new life. This is also, I mentioned to you the other day, the amount of time that Lawrence spends reading and researching and in the libraries and in the cultural centers trying to first write the captions. In fact, the captions, when he and his wife, Gwendolyn Knight, are working on this series, they write the captions first. So when you're looking at this series, and I would encourage you, I don't know if I mentioned this yesterday in the audio recording or not, but if you want to get a chronological view of the series, go and look at that MoMA webpage. What I've done here in this PowerPoint is I've divided the slides into 3 different groups that we're going to talk about. But if you want to get that arc to the story, go back to that MoMA website you had on the first assignment for this and click through each of the slides. And remember, when you're looking through them, that the captions come first. They had written those ideas based on their tremendous amount of research, and then the paintings came second. But one of the books that he was reading is a book from 1920 by Emmett J. Scott, and the book is entitled Negro Migration During the War. Negro Migration During the War from 1920. Each of the cities in this first panel, Chicago, New York, and St. Louis, receives its own chapter because of the significance of these 3 cities to the end result of the Great Migration. In the next slide, number 3, you can see a woman standing in front of these panels. They are very small, as you can see here. They're about approximately 18 by 12 inches each on board, which forces you to interact very closely with them. You have to get right up to be able to see all the painting that Lawrence is doing. You have to get up very closely as well to interact with that text that is being written underneath each painting as well. If you jump to slide number 5, this is the open book, the open cover of the book, dust jacket of a very famous book, also published in 1941, by Richard Wright. Richard Wright, you probably have heard of before. He is most famous for being the novelist for the books Black Boy and Native Son. But this book It's very similar in a way to what Jacob Lawrence is doing, but instead of using painting, he's using photographs. As I mentioned yesterday in the recording, the New Deal provides lots of different funds for different professions, and one of those programs of the New Deal was the Farm Security Administration, or the FSA. And what the FSA did was they paid photographers and journalists to go and record and to write about and to research a lot of the devastation that farmers all throughout the United States were suffering, not only because of the economic calamity of the Great Depression, but also because of a lot of the agricultural disasters that had happened during the decade of the 1930s as well, and before. So what Richard Wright does in this book is he gathers a lot of the photographs that were being used and taken by the Farm Security Administration, photographs from the Associated Press, different news agencies, and also photographs that Richard Wright had taken himself. And it is comparing, this book, 12 Million Black Voices, it's comparing life from between the rural areas of the United States and the urban areas in the United States. As an example, I've given you one set of slides here in, I guess this would be slide number 6, one different comparison from the book. And you can see from the kitchenette to the white folks' kitchen. What this is depicting is the life of African Americans both in rural southern areas on the left and then in urban northern areas on the right. How their lives have both changed and not changed during this great migration. So here, most of the pictures are from the south part of Chicago, and that's where this particular picture on the right is being taken. But remember, this is one of the major cities that's receiving this influx of migration from the south to the north. So the next slide, getting into the work itself, and I use that Richard Wright example to only show you that this is what Jacob Lawrence is doing at this time is not necessarily unique. Richard Wright is doing it with photography. Jacob Lawrence is going to be doing it with painting. This is really, he's hitting what Jacob Lawrence is doing, what we've talked about with all great artists. He's hitting the nail on the head. He's being in the right place at the right time to be able to complete a work or a cycle of paintings with such subject matter, knowing that there is a desire to consume information like this. So in 1940, I am on slide number 7 now. In 1940, Lawrence receives a fund of $1,500 to be able to secure an apartment, a studio space, and to have the time to be able to commit to research for his new cycle. Of course, he's already completed cycles on lives of iconic black heroes, and so this background knowledge helps him secure this grant so that he can spend all of his time working on the research for this new project of his, which will be the Migration series. When the project is complete in 1941, a woman by the name of Edith Halpert, Halpert, who's a very fascinating figure in her own right. She owns an art gallery in Greenwich Village called the Downtown Gallery. It was a gallery founded in 1926 for really to promote American art specifically. But Edith Halpert is very interesting in displaying Lawrence's Migration series. And one of the ways that gallery owners publicize the works and upcoming shows is they put them in magazines. So in November of 1941, Fortune magazine, I'm on slide number 7, publishes 26 different panels of the 60-panel series in their periodical. Now remember, Fortune magazine, Life magazine, Look magazine, these have all become very famous, widely distributed magazines that people across the country are reading. And one of the things that Jacob Lawrence is interested in when he is creating this series that's where who's a very fascinating figure in her own right. And so the series was a gallery founded in 1926 for really to promote American art specifically. But Edith Halper is very interesting in displaying Lawrence's migration series. And one of the ways that gallery owners publicize the works and upcoming shows is they put them in magazines. So in November of 1941, Fortune magazine, I'm on slide number 7, publishes 26 different panels of the 60 panel series in their periodical. Now remember, Fortune magazine, Life magazine, Look magazine, these have all become very famous, widely distributed magazines that people across the country are reading. And one of the things that Jacob Lawrence is interested in when he is creating this series is when you look at the paintings, you see that they are lots of solid colors. They seem to be very easily replicated. There's kind of this notion that they're graphic images. And so the series was a big hit. This November 1941 issue of Fortune magazine brings tons of attention to the series, and Edith Halper arranges for a show that is going to be entitled American Negro Art, and to be shown at her gallery in November and December of 1941. Now, in November of 1941, the show was really only open to critics and museum owners and people with lots of resources to possibly bid on the works. The opening of the show, the American Negro Art Show, was scheduled for December 8th, 1941. And if you know your history, on December 7th, 1941 is the day of Pearl Harbor. So it throws the show into a state of flux and confusion. It continues to happen, but this, what was supposed to be this grand opening and this big reveal to the greater public of Lawrence's The Migration series, is undercut in many ways by the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So for those of you, I guess the lesson here, for those of you seniors who I feel awful for you, I know that your senior year in many ways has been truncated early, but this is, you can identify a little bit with how Jacob Lawrence must have felt in December of 1941 when the big opening for his show was undermined by national events, international events. Anyway, in the exhibit in 1941, there are many people interested in buying the works. And of those people that are interested are many different collectors and institutions. And Edith Halper secures 2 major institutions to buy the works. And they are the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And so one of the museums gets one half, the other museum gets the other half in this Solomonic division. I think that was part of your Peter Sheldjadal reading when he talks about how the paintings were cut in half. This is a reference to Solomon of the Bible, who, when 2 women are warring over who a child belongs to, he says, we'll cut the child in half. One woman says, no, I do not want to cut the child in half. And so that's how Solomon knows that this particular woman is the real biological mother, because the real biological mother, would never want to cut her child in half. Anyway, this is not always seen by Lawrence as a necessarily negative idea, the idea that his works were cut in half for 2 different institutions. He was asked once about it being split up, and he responded with, "It wasn't. It's in two places, two very prestigious places, the Phillips Collection and the Museum of Modern Art." So Lawrence is very excited that his works go on to have such long-lasting visibility in these very heavily trafficked, frequented, prestigious museums. So the next two slides, of course, are just images of Lawrence's very easily reproduced, those strong color blocks. They lend themselves very well to graphic publications, graphic being, of course, the serialized reproduction of images in Fortune magazine, which would have been read all throughout the country. Now, if you jump to slide number 14, this is where I'm going to begin the discussion of Lawrence's actual works. And I'm going to start with slide number 5. If I didn't mention this, I forget. I've done so many of these audio recordings that I've had to delete. I forget which ones I sent out to you and which ones I've had to erase. But if you're ever confused about the chronological number of the panel, if you look on the bottom right-hand corner, you will see that he's painted a number. So we're going to start with panel number 5. And the three divisions that I'm going to divide these into are scenes that depict trains and railroads. We'll start with this one. Obviously, it's a great one to start with in terms of depicting a train. The second will be scenes that depict movement, groups specifically, right? Massive movements of groups. And the third set that we'll discuss are scenes of isolation. So what I'll probably do is I'll do one recording for each of those. Trains, railroads, movements in groups, and scenes of isolation.